For your entire life, you've been told a story. A simple story about how we became who we are. First, we learned to farm. The stability of agriculture allowed us to settle down, build villages, then cities. With full bellies and a roof over our heads, we finally had the time and resources to develop complex society, art, and organized religion. It's the foundational rule of human history. Agriculture is the spark that ignites civilization. But what if that entire story is a lie? What if the spark wasn't a seed, but an idea? What if the grand cathedrals of human belief didn't come after we settled down, but were the very reason we settled down in the first place? For decades, this was a fringe, almost laughable idea, until we found a place that shouldn't exist. A place built 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the Great Pyramids of Giza. A complex of massive, intricately carved stone temples, built not by farmers or city dwellers, but by primitive hunter-gatherers. Stone Age people who, according to our own history books, should have been living in caves, chasing mammoths, and struggling for daily survival. Instead, they were quarrying, transporting, and erecting multi-ton pillars of limestone with the precision of master engineers. They built the world's first temple. And then, after 1,000 years of worship, they did something even more mysterious. They deliberately and painstakingly buried their entire creation under 1 million cubic feet of earth, hiding it from the world, and walked away forever. This isn't a forgotten chapter of our history. This is a completely different book. And the central mystery, the question that haunts every archaeologist who sets foot there, is not just how they built it, but why they buried it. Deep in the sun-scorched plains of southeastern Turkey, there is a hill. For generations, local farmers called it Göbekli Tepe, which in Turkish means potbelly hill. It was just a rounded, unassuming feature on the landscape, notable only for the scattered pieces of flint and limestone that littered its slopes. Farmers would occasionally find strange, carved stones while plowing their fields, moving them aside without a second thought. They considered the hill to be an old, abandoned medieval cemetery, a place best left undisturbed. For decades, even archaeologists dismissed it. In the 1960s, a team from the University of Chicago surveyed the area, saw the limestone slabs, and concluded they were nothing more than broken gravestones. They packed up and left, unaware that they were standing on top of the single greatest archaeological discovery of the modern era. They were standing on a secret 12,000 years old. The story of its true discovery begins in 1994, with a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt. Schmidt was working on a nearby dig and had read the old Chicago report, but something about it bothered him. He knew the local area was a hotbed of Stone Age activity. He knew the kind of flint tools found on the hill were characteristic of a pre-pottery, pre-agricultural society. The idea of a medieval cemetery just didn't fit, so he decided to take a look for himself. When he arrived at Potbelly Hill, he saw what the others had seen: the flint, the broken limestone. But Schmidt saw it with different eyes. He noticed the sheer scale of the debris. He saw that the limestone slabs weren't just random rocks. They were clearly worked by human hands. He saw the distinct shape of what looked like a capital T, a form he'd never seen in any medieval cemetery. His heart began to pound. He realized this wasn't a graveyard on a hill. The hill was the graveyard, a man-made mountain, an artificial tell, built up over millennia, burying something monumental. Schmidt knew in that instant that he had two choices: walk away and spend the rest of his life wondering, or dedicate his entire career to uncovering what lay beneath his feet. He chose the latter. He would spend the next 20 years of his life here, unearthing a structure so old and so sophisticated, it would shatter our understanding of the ancient world. What Schmidt and his team began to uncover was, to put it mildly, impossible. Just a few feet beneath the surface, they found not just a few pillars but circles of them. Massive T-shaped monoliths of limestone, arranged in precise ritualistic rings. The largest of these pillars stand over 18 feet tall and weigh an estimated 16 tons. To put that in perspective, that's the weight of 2 full-grown African elephants. These pillars were not crude, unfinished rocks. They were elegant, stylized representations of the human form, with arms carved in low relief along their sides, hands pointing towards their waists, draped in what appeared to be loincloths. But they weren't just carved with human features. The pillars were a veritable zoo of the prehistoric world. They were covered in breathtakingly detailed carvings of lethal creatures: snarling foxes, venomous snakes, charging boars, scorpions, and vultures. These weren't the animals they ate. There were almost no carvings of deer or gazelle, the staples of their diet. This was something else. This was a world of powerful, dangerous symbols, a pantheon of animal gods or perhaps animal spirits. The engineering required to create this is mind-boggling. The limestone was quarried from a bedrock shelf nearly a quarter-mile away. Using nothing more than flint tools, these Stone Age people had to hew these 16-ton blocks out of the solid rock. Then they had to transport them uphill to the summit. How? We still have no idea. There's no evidence of wheels. No evidence of domesticated beasts of burden. It would have required hundreds of people, working together with a shared plan, a common goal, and a sophisticated level of social organization that we simply didn't believe hunter-gatherers possessed. And they didn't just build one of these stone circles. They built dozens. So far, ground-penetrating radar has revealed at least 20 of these enclosures buried within the hill, containing an estimated 200 massive pillars. We have only excavated 4 of them. What we've seen so far is less than 5% of the entire complex. This discovery sent a shockwave through the world of archaeology. The established timeline of human civilization, the one taught in every textbook, was built on a simple premise. The agricultural revolution around 10,000 years ago was the great catalyst. It was the Big Bang of civilization. But Göbekli Tepe is dated to 11,600 years ago. That's 1,000 years before the invention of farming. 1,000 years before the domestication of animals. It's a time when humanity was supposed to be living in small egalitarian nomadic bands. They weren't supposed to have the social structure to organize a massive labor force. They weren't supposed to have the specialized skills of masons and artists. And most importantly, they weren't supposed to have religion. At least not like this. Small-scale shamanism, maybe, but not this. This was a cathedral on a hill. A massive, coordinated ritual center that would have been a prehistoric Mecca, drawing people from 100 miles in every direction. The evidence is overwhelming. The animal bones found at the site aren't from domesticated animals, but from wild game, suggesting massive feasts. The sheer scale of the project implies that it wasn't the work of a single village, but a collaborative effort of many different hunter-gatherer groups. It forces us to ask a terrifying question. What if the story is backwards? What if the intense, shared belief required to build a monument like Göbekli Tepe came first? What if the need to feed the hundreds of workers who gathered to build this temple was the very pressure that forced us to invent agriculture in the first place? It's a radical inversion of history. The idea that it wasn't a surplus of food that led to religion, but that the desire for religion, the desire to build something for the gods, is what drove us to create a surplus of food. That civilization itself was not born in a field of wheat, but in the heart of a temple. This is the revolution that Göbekli Tepe represents. It suggests that what truly propelled us from a scattered species of hunter-gatherers into the builders of pyramids and skyscrapers wasn't a change in our tools, but a change in our minds. A cognitive revolution that led to complex symbolism, shared myth, and the ability to cooperate on a scale never before seen. But this revelation, as profound as it is, only deepens the central enigma of Potbelly Hill. After a millennium of use around 8000 BCE, the people who built Göbekli Tepe began to do the unthinkable. They systematically and deliberately backfilled the entire site. They hauled in millions of cubic feet of dirt, stone, and animal bones and buried their sacred circles. They didn't just abandon it to the elements. They erased it. They entombed their own creation, preserving it perfectly in a man-made hill, and then they vanished. Why? Why would a culture spend centuries, generations of effort, building the most spectacular monument on Earth, only to hide it from the future? What were they trying to protect? Or what were they trying to contain? To answer that, we have to peel back the layers of what we thought we knew about our own past. Because the people who built Göbekli Tepe shouldn't have existed. According to the timeline of human history that was taught in every school, written in every textbook, a project of this scale at this time was flat out impossible. Let's put this in perspective. The oldest of the Great Pyramids at Giza was built around 2500 BC. Stonehenge in England around 3000 BC. Göbekli Tepe? The earliest layers date back to 9600 BC. That's not just a little older. That is an almost unimaginable gap in time. We are talking about a structure that is 7,000 years older than the pyramids. 7,000 years. So old it makes the Roman Colosseum look like it was built yesterday. It was ancient to the people who built ancient Sumeria. So, who were these master builders? Who were these architects of the impossible? The answer is the single most earth-shattering part of this discovery. They were hunter-gatherers. Now let that phrase sink in. Hunter-gatherers. What does that bring to mind? Small nomadic bands of people, maybe 20 or 30 individuals, dressed in animal skins, constantly on the move, following herds of game, foraging for berries and nuts. Their entire existence was a struggle for daily survival. They lived in caves or temporary huts. Their toolkit consisted of sharpened sticks and flint arrowheads. Right? That's the image we all have. Primal. Rudimentary. And for decades, that's exactly what archaeologists and historians believed. The great leap forward for humanity, the spark that lit the fire of civilization, was agriculture. The agricultural revolution, around 800 BC. The idea was simple. Once we learned to plant crops and domesticate animals, we could stop wandering. We could settle down in one place. This led to villages, then towns, then cities. It created food surpluses, which allowed some people to stop farming and become specialists: priests, soldiers, artisans, and architects. Only with the stability and resources of farming could we ever develop complex religion, social hierarchies, and monumental construction. It was a neat, tidy, and logical progression. Göbekli Tepe takes that entire timeline, that entire beautiful theory, and shatters it into a million pieces. Because here in 9600 BC, a full 1,000 years before the invention of widespread agriculture, we have a society of hunter-gatherers quarrying, transporting, and erecting hundreds of multi-ton limestone pillars with a precision that would be a challenge even today. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving. They were organized. They were inspired. They had a grand vision that transcended the daily hunt. This is the puzzle that confronted the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt when he first began excavating the site in 1994. Local farmers had long known about the hill, occasionally finding strange pieces of flint and limestone. They called it Göbekli Tepe, which in Turkish means potbelly hill. Most archaeologists had dismissed it as nothing more than a medieval cemetery. But Schmidt saw something different. He saw the sheer volume of high-quality flint chips on the surface, far more than any small band would ever need. He had a hunch, a wild career-defining hunch. When his team started digging, they didn't find graves. They found the tops of enormous T-shaped pillars, arranged in perfect circles. As they dug deeper, the scale of the structure became terrifyingly clear. This wasn't a cemetery. This was a cathedral. A prehistoric cathedral built by people who weren't supposed to be capable of such a thing. Schmidt later said, "Knowing what we know now, a person who would have claimed something like this existed would have been considered a lunatic." And what they were uncovering was not just a marvel of engineering, but a window into a lost world of belief. The pillars themselves are the key. They are not just structural supports. Most of them stand between 10 and 20 feet tall and weigh up to 20 tons. The largest one, still in the quarry nearby, is 23 feet long and weighs an estimated 50 tons. Think about that. Moving a 50-ton block of stone without wheels, without beasts of burden, without metal tools. How? But it's their shape that's most revealing. They are stylized human figures. You can see arms carved in relief along their sides, with hands pointing down toward their waists, where they wear intricately carved loincloths. But they have no faces, no eyes, no mouths. They are anonymous, powerful, godlike beings standing in silent assembly. It's the first known depiction of gods in human form, a concept so profound it would form the basis of nearly every religion to follow. These hunter-gatherers weren't just building a temple. They were populating it with their deities. And these silent stone giants are not alone. Their surfaces are covered, absolutely teeming, with exquisitely carved reliefs of animals. But these aren't the animals they ate every day. You don't see many deer or gazelles. Instead, you see predators and scavengers, lethal creatures, poisonous snakes coiling up the sides of pillars, spiders, scorpions with their tails arched, ready to strike, snarling foxes, ferocious wild boars, and powerful lions. And then there are the vultures. Vultures are everywhere at Göbekli Tepe. They are shown in complex scenes, often interacting with headless human bodies. This has led many to believe the site was connected to a specific kind of funerary ritual, perhaps an excarnation ceremony. where the bodies of the dead were left exposed on the hill for vultures to consume, releasing the soul to the heavens. A practice still seen in some cultures today. This place wasn't just for celebration. It was a place that stared death, and what comes after, directly in the face. This was their sacred zoo, a stone library of their cosmology. Each animal was likely a symbol, a piece of a larger story, a mythology we can no longer read. They were telling us who they were, what they feared, what they revered. And the message is clear. Their world was a dangerous, powerful, and deeply spiritual place. But here's where it gets even stranger. As the archaeologists expanded their survey of the area, they looked for the one thing they expected to find right next to a massive ceremonial center. A city, a town, even a small village. Where did the builders live? Where did the priests who ran this place sleep? Where did the thousands of pilgrims who must have traveled here stay? They found nothing. No evidence of permanent settlement. No houses, no hearths, no trash pits filled with the debris of daily life. It seems Göbekli Tepe stood alone on its hilltop, a sacred destination in an otherwise empty landscape. It was a place you traveled to, not a place you lived at. A prehistoric Vatican, a Mecca of the Stone Age, built by nomadic tribes who would gather here for reasons of immense importance, before dispersing back into the wilderness. This completely upends the old model of civilization. The story used to be that we built temples after we built cities. But Göbekli Tepe suggests the opposite. It suggests that the very idea of building something permanent and sacred together, this shared spiritual project, is what drew people together in the first place. The desire to worship, to create a home for the gods, might have been the catalyst that pushed humanity towards settlement and agriculture. Religion may have been the invention that sparked the invention of civilization itself. We are left with a ghost civilization, a people with the social organization of a modern state, the artistic skill of Renaissance masters, and the engineering prowess to move mountains, who left behind no homes, no writing, no pottery, nothing but this one breathtaking, impossible temple. It forces us to ask the most fundamental question. How? How did a society of hunter-gatherers, without the food surplus from farming, manage to organize and feed a massive workforce for centuries? Building this wasn't a weekend project. It took generations. It required planners, quarrymen, artists, and hundreds upon hundreds of laborers. How do you convince that many people to stop hunting, to stop gathering, and to dedicate their lives to carving a hill into a house for the gods? What kind of leader, what kind of belief system could command that kind of devotion? The answer, it seems, lies in the birth of an idea more powerful than any single chieftain or hunter: organized religion. Before kings, there were priests. Before palaces, there were temples. Göbekli Tepe suggests that the first time humanity truly organized itself on a mass scale wasn't for war, or for farming, but for God. Or more likely, for the gods. Imagine a figure, a shaman, a storyteller. Someone who could interpret the rustling of the leaves, the flight of a bird, the patterns of the stars. In a world of constant uncertainty, where every day was a battle for survival against predators, starvation, and the elements, this person offered something priceless: answers. A sense of control. They could explain the unexplainable. They could tell you why the rains failed, why the gazelle herds moved, what happened when you died. And they could tell you what the unseen forces of the world demanded in return. This figure, or a council of them, would have been the architects of Göbekli Tepe. They were the first project managers, the first spiritual engineers. They didn't command with swords and spears. They commanded with belief. They convinced hundreds of people that their labor, their sweat, their very lives, were a necessary sacrifice to appease the cosmos. They promised fertility, successful hunts, protection from the evils that lurked in the dark. And in return, the people gave them their time, their energy, and their devotion. This wasn't just a construction project. It was an act of faith on a scale never before seen. And what a sight for their rituals it was. The evidence found scattered around the pillars tells a story of massive gatherings. Archaeologists have unearthed tens of thousands of animal bones. Not just a few scraps from a family meal, but industrial quantities. We're talking about the remains of gazelles, aurochs, the wild ancestors of modern cattle, boars, and birds. Crucially, these bones show signs of feasting on a grand scale. They weren't just random leftovers. They were the remnants of enormous barbecues, of ritual feasts that likely drew people from miles and miles around. This wasn't a quiet place of silent prayer. This was humanity's first festival ground. Picture it. The sun setting over the Anatolian plains, the sky ablaze with stars clearer than we can ever imagine. The flickering light of dozens of bonfires dances across the faces of the giant T-shaped pillars, making the carved animals seem to writhe and twist in the shadows. The air is thick with the smell of roasting meat and wood smoke. You hear the rhythmic beat of a drum, the hypnotic sound of chanting, the murmur of hundreds of voices speaking in a language lost to time. This was a place of pilgrimage. For generations, different clans and tribes, who might have otherwise been rivals, would put down their spears and gather here. They would share food, exchange stories, arrange marriages, and most importantly, participate in the rituals that they believed kept the world in balance. It was the original social network, a place where a scattered people became a society, bound together by a shared purpose and a shared sacred space. Some researchers even speculate that they consumed hallucinogenic plants, like wild rye infected with ergot, to induce trance-like states and commune directly with the spirit world they were trying to honor. This was a full sensory, mind-altering experience, designed to awe and inspire. But what were they worshipping? What were they trying to communicate with? The pillars themselves are the best clues we have. They are a stone zoo of the Pleistocene world. But the selection of animals is strange. You see very few peaceful herbivores, the animals they hunted most often for food, like deer or gazelle, though we know from the bone pits they ate plenty of them. Instead, the pillars are dominated by things that bite, sting, and kill. You see snarling foxes, their teeth bared. You see powerful muscular boars and wild bulls. You see long slithering snakes, often in writhing groups. There are scorpions, spiders, and giant vultures with massive wingspans. And most terrifyingly, there are leopards depicted lunging, ready to pounce, carved in high relief so they almost jump out from the stone. These aren't just pictures of animals. They are symbols of power, of danger, of the raw, untamable forces of nature. Why this obsession with the deadly and the dangerous? One theory is that these weren't just animals, they were guardians. In many shamanistic traditions, the spirit world is not a friendly place. It's a dangerous realm that a shaman must navigate, protected by spirit guides and allies. Perhaps these terrifying creatures carved on the pillars were meant to be just that, powerful spiritual bodyguards, protecting the sacred space from evil forces, or perhaps acting as gatekeepers that only the initiated could pass. Another idea is that each pillar, and its primary animal, represented a different human group, a different clan. The leopard clan would meet at this pillar, the snake clan at another. It would be their emblem, their mascot, a physical representation of their identity carved in stone for eternity. This would make Göbekli Tepe a kind of prehistoric United Nations, a meeting place for different tribes, each with their own powerful totem. But there is one pillar, in the most famous enclosure, Enclosure D, that tells a much darker, much more specific story. It's known to archaeologists as Pillar 43, but you might know it as the Vulture Stone. And it is, without a doubt, one of the most important and chilling artifacts ever recovered from the ancient world. The top of the pillar is dominated by a massive vulture. Its wing is outstretched, almost protectively. To the left, you see other animals, a scorpion, other birds. But it's what's below the vulture that stops you in your tracks. There, lying on the ground, is the figure of a human, and the human is missing its head. This isn't a simple hunting scene. The figure is clearly human, ithyphallic, and its head is gone. The vulture stands directly above it. To many researchers, this is a clear, unambiguous depiction of a specific ritual practice, excarnation. This is the practice of leaving a dead body exposed to the elements, for birds of prey, vultures, to consume the flesh, leaving only the bones. It's a sky burial. This practice, which seems gruesome to us, was common in many ancient cultures, from Zoroastrians in Persia to certain Native American tribes. The logic was that the vulture, a creature that soars between the earth and the heavens, was a sacred psychopomp, a creature that could carry the soul of the deceased from the physical world to the spiritual afterlife. The flesh was temporary, a burden. The soul needed to be liberated, and the vulture was its divine transport. Suddenly, the purpose of Göbekli Tepe snaps into a much sharper, more profound focus. This wasn't just a place for feasting and celebrating life. It was a place for processing death. It was a funerary complex, a massive necropolis dedicated to ushering the dead into the next world. The terrifying animals aren't just random symbols. They are the denizens of that other world, the spirit realm that the dead were about to enter. The entire site could be seen as a giant machine for resurrection, a gateway between the land of the living and the land of the dead. This changes everything. It means that 12,000 years ago, our hunter-gatherer ancestors had a complex, highly sophisticated understanding of life, death, and the soul's journey. They believed in an afterlife so strongly that they were willing to move mountains to build a proper departure lounge for it. The headless man on the vulture stone isn't a victim of some random act of violence. He is the central character in the most important story of all, the story of what happens after we die. But the vulture stone has another, even more explosive secret. It's not just a religious scene. Some researchers are now convinced that the animals carved around that headless man are not animals at all. They are constellations, and that this stone is not just a tombstone. It's a star map, recording a specific date and a specific cataclysmic event that changed the world forever. This theory, proposed by researchers Martin Sweatman and Demetrius Tsakritsis, is so radical, so completely world-altering, that for years the mainstream archaeological community simply ignored it. Because if they're right, it means the people of Göbekli Tepe weren't just brilliant builders and artists. They were brilliant astronomers. They possessed a knowledge of the cosmos that we thought was impossible for their time. They argue that Pillar 43, the vulture stone, is a cosmic time capsule, a message carved in stone, telling a story of the single worst day in the last 20,000 years of human history. To understand their claim, we have to learn to read their language. Not a language of words, but of stars. Look at the scorpion carved at the bottom of the pillar. To these researchers, that's not just a scorpion. It's the constellation Scorpius, low on the horizon. The bird above it, the one that gives the pillar its name, the vulture, isn't a vulture. It's the constellation Sagittarius. In many ancient cultures, the stars that we see as the archer's bow and arrow were seen as a great celestial bird. And the other animals? The swimming bird, the long-necked bird, and the bird on the far right? They believe these represent the three bright stars of the summer triangle, Vega, Deneb, and Altair. Even the headless man, the symbol of death and disaster, has a celestial meaning. He represents humanity, struck down by this event. The circle held by the vulture? That could be the sun, or it could be the agent of this destruction. Now this is where it gets truly mind-blowing. If this is a star map, it's a snapshot of the sky at a very specific moment in time. But how could we possibly know when that moment was? The answer lies in one of the most subtle and magnificent movements of our planet. It's a phenomenon called the precession of the equinoxes. Imagine the Earth spinning like a top. As it spins, it also has a very slow, very slight wobble. This wobble takes about 26,000 years to complete one full cycle. What this means for us watching from the ground is that the positions of the constellations in the sky slowly drift over centuries and millennia. The North Star hasn't always been Polaris. The constellation rising at the spring equinox changes over time. This celestial drift is like a giant cosmic clock. And because it's predictable, we can wind it backwards. Using sophisticated astronomical software, Sweatman and Tsakritsis did exactly that. They took the star map on the vulture stone and asked the computer a simple question. When, in the last 20,000 years, did the sky look exactly like this? When were these specific constellations in these exact positions relative to the setting sun? The software churned through the millennia, calculating the slow, majestic dance of the stars. And it found a match. Not a dozen matches, not 100. It found one. A single, precise window in human history. The date encoded on the vulture stone, the day of the cataclysm, was 10,950 BC. Give or take 250 years. Now, if that date means nothing to you, you're not alone. But to geologists, climatologists, and a growing number of archaeologists, that date is everything. It is one of the most significant and violent moments in recent geological history, because 10,950 BC is the exact moment that the world changed. It's the year the planet was plunged back into a brutal 1,000-year-long winter. It's the beginning of a period known as the Younger Dryas. Imagine the scene. For 1,000 years, the Great Ice Age had been ending. The massive glaciers that covered North America and Europe were in full retreat. The climate was warming, forests were spreading, and megafauna like the woolly mammoth and saber-toothed cat roamed the land. Humanity was on the cusp of a new, warmer, more stable world. The world that would eventually give rise to agriculture and civilization as we know it. And then, in the geological blink of an eye, it all stopped. The warming trend didn't just slow down, it violently reversed. Average temperatures in the northern hemisphere plummeted by as much as 27 degrees Fahrenheit. The glaciers stopped retreating and began to advance again. The world froze over. For the next 1,200 years, humanity shivered in a world that had suddenly, inexplicably, been thrown back into the depths of the Ice Age. For decades, scientists had no idea what caused it. How could the entire planet's climate system just break? They proposed everything from changes in ocean currents to massive volcanic eruptions. But none of the theories perfectly fit the evidence. The event was too sudden, too violent, too global. Then a new theory emerged. A theory so catastrophic it sounds like science fiction. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. This theory proposes that the deep freeze was triggered by an extraterrestrial event. Specifically, that the Earth passed through the debris stream of a giant disintegrating comet, and that multiple fragments of this comet, some a mile wide, slammed into the planet. The impacts wouldn't have been a single explosion, but a shotgun blast from space, hitting the North American ice sheet and exploding in the air across the globe. The result would have been an apocalypse. Unimaginable firestorms would have incinerated entire continents, blotting out the sun with smoke and soot. The shockwave would have pulverized the ice sheet, releasing an unimaginable torrent of fresh water into the North Atlantic, shutting down the ocean currents that regulate our climate. A nuclear winter, but without the nuclear bomb. A planetary catastrophe. The evidence for this is etched into the Earth's soil. At the precise geological layer corresponding to the start of the Younger Dryas, scientists have found a black mat stretching across continents. And within that mat, they've found clues. Microscopic diamonds that can only be formed under the extreme pressure and temperature of an impact. A spike in platinum, an element rare on Earth but common in asteroids and comets. Tiny spheres of melted rock and glass that were blasted into the atmosphere and rained back down. This was the event. This was the cataclysm. An estimated 75% of the large animal species in North America, including the mammoths, mastodons, and saber-toothed cats, were wiped out almost overnight. Human populations like the Clovis people in America seem to have vanished from the archaeological record. It was a global reset button. And now look back at the vulture stone. The headless man, a symbol of mass death. The animals representing the constellations, marking a precise date. 10,950 BC, the exact date the Younger Dryas began. The exact date the comet is theorized to have hit. Is this a coincidence? Or is Pillar 43 a detailed, astronomical observation of the day the sky fell? Is Göbekli Tepe an eyewitness account of the apocalypse? The people who built this temple weren't just mourning their dead. They were recording the agent of their destruction. They were pointing to the sky, to the constellation Sagittarius, near the heart of the Milky Way, as the source of the swarm of comets that had devastated their world. They were creating a permanent memorial, a cosmic billboard, to ensure that no one ever forgot what had happened. This single stone transforms our understanding of this place. It suggests that Göbekli Tepe wasn't just built out of some newfound spiritual impulse. It was built in response to a trauma, a global, world-shattering trauma that pushed humanity to the very brink of extinction. The survivors, the ones who watched the sky burn and the world freeze, came together in this one sacred place. They quarried these massive stones, dragged them for miles, and carved them with a message for the future. But the message might be even more complex than just a memorial, because the vulture stone wasn't the only pillar with astronomical alignments. The entire site, it seems, was built with the heavens in mind. And this raises an even more profound question. If these hunter-gatherers were such sophisticated astronomers that they could record the date of a comet impact, what else did they know? And why, after 1,000 years of use, did they deliberately and painstakingly bury their entire temple, hiding it from the world for the next 11,000 years? What were they trying to preserve? Or what were they trying to protect us from? The question hangs in the air, thick with the dust of millennia. Why bury it? This wasn't a simple abandonment. This was a project on the same monumental scale as the temple's construction. To backfill these massive enclosures, to cover these 10-ton pillars, would have required moving over 300,000 cubic meters of earth, rock, and debris. They used limestone chips, animal bones, and flint tools, packing it all in layer by layer. This was a deliberate entombment, a final great act. The last message of the Göbekli Tepe people was to make their greatest achievement disappear. And for 11,000 years they succeeded. This act transforms Göbekli Tepe from a mere archaeological site into a time capsule. A message in a bottle, thrown into the deep ocean of history, waiting for a future generation to find it. But what was the message? Was it a warning? A memorial? A sacred secret to be protected at all costs? To find the answer, we have to look closer at the symbols they left behind, specifically at one pillar that might just be the Rosetta Stone of this entire lost civilization. It's called Pillar 43, but it's better known as the Vulture Stone. It sits in Enclosure D, one of the oldest and most complex circles. And it is terrifying. Like the other pillars, it's covered in reliefs, but these aren't just a random assortment of animals. This, many researchers believe, is a story, a snapshot of a single catastrophic moment in time. At the top of the pillar, there are carvings of a scorpion, a long-necked bird resembling a crane or ibis, and another bird, its wings outstretched. Below them, dominating the stone, is a massive vulture. Its right wing is raised, as if it's lifting something. And just below that wing there is a circle, a disc. The most chilling detail, however, is at the very bottom. It's a human figure, but it's headless. A clear, unambiguous symbol of death. For years, this was interpreted as a sky burial scene. The vulture carrying the soul, or the head, of the deceased to the heavens. It's a practice seen in many ancient cultures. But what if it's more? What if it's not just a scene but a map? A map of the sky. In 2017, two engineers from the University of Edinburgh, Martin Sweatman and Demetrius Tsakritsis, published a groundbreaking paper. They proposed that the animal carvings on the Vulture Stone aren't just animals. They are constellations. The scorpion is, quite obviously, Scorpio. The bird with the outstretched wings corresponds perfectly to Sagittarius. The other figures align with Libra, Pisces, and Virgo. The people of Göbekli Tepe weren't just hunters. They were sophisticated astronomers. They were mapping the stars. But why map them in this specific configuration? Because star maps are also calendars. The position of the stars changes over thousands of years due to a phenomenon called precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis. By running the star pattern on the Vulture Stone through computer models, Sweatman and his team could pinpoint the exact date it depicts. The date they landed on was 10,950 BC, give or take 250 years. That date is electric. It is one of the most significant and violent moments in recent geological history. It's the very beginning of a period known as the Younger Dryas. For several thousand years, the Earth had been warming, shaking off the last ice age. Glaciers were retreating, forests were expanding, and humanity was thriving. Then suddenly, with terrifying speed, the climate plunged back into a deep freeze. Temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropped by as much as 15 degrees Celsius in less than a decade. It was an abrupt, catastrophic climate shock that lasted for over 1,000 years. What could cause such a sudden, violent change? The leading theory for decades was a massive flood of freshwater from a melting North American ice sheet that shut down the Atlantic Ocean currents. But a more recent and far more controversial theory points to the sky. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. This theory proposes that around 12,900 years ago, a fragmented comet or asteroid slammed into the Earth's atmosphere over North America. The impact, or the series of airbursts, would have been cataclysmic. It would have ignited continent-spanning wildfires, melted the ice sheet instantly, triggered megatsunamis, and thrown so much dust and smoke into the atmosphere that it blocked out the sun, triggering the instant winter of the Younger Dryas. It would have been an extinction-level event. And it was. The megafauna of North America, the mammoths, the mastodons, the saber-toothed cats, were wiped out almost overnight. Now look again at the Vulture Stone. The date it marks is 10,950 BC, the exact moment of the Younger Dryas cataclysm. The headless man represents the mass death of humanity. The animals are the constellations marking the date of the event. And what about the vulture, the central figure? In many mythologies, the vulture is associated with the realm of the dead, but it's also a psychopomp, a guide for souls. And what is it holding or pointing to with its wing? A circle, a disc. Could that disc be a representation of the sun? And could the animals, the constellations, be telling us where in the sky to look? Proponents of this theory believe the Vulture Stone is a detailed record. The animals aren't just constellations. They are symbols for the year's solstices and equinoxes. They believe the stone is a precise date stamp for the day the sky fell, the day a comet, or a swarm of comets, as represented by the various animals, came and wiped out a huge portion of life on Earth. Under this interpretation, Göbekli Tepe takes on a completely new, and much darker meaning. It's a memorial, a monument built by the survivors of a global catastrophe. The headless figures seen on the pillars aren't just symbols. They are depictions of the countless dead. The people who built this temple weren't celebrating the birth of a new world. They were mourning the death of an old one. And the burial? The painstaking thousand-year effort to entomb their own creation? It was the ultimate act of preservation. They weren't hiding it from their enemies. They were preserving a message for the future. They carved a warning into stone, a detailed astronomical account of the worst day in human history, and then they buried it, hoping that a future civilization, advanced enough to understand the language of the stars, would one day uncover it and heed its warning. They were trying to protect us. It's a mind-bending, terrifying, and compelling theory. It paints the builders of Göbekli Tepe as the traumatized survivors of a lost golden age, a civilization perhaps far more advanced than we imagine, which was wiped from the face of the earth by a cosmic impact. But it is still a theory, and most mainstream archaeologists see a very different story in the dirt. They argue there's no need to look to the stars for an explanation when the answer is right here on Earth. They believe the burial of Göbekli Tepe wasn't an act of fear, but an act of profound social and religious change. It wasn't a panicked reaction to a cosmic disaster. It was a slow, deliberate, and ritualistic funeral, a funeral for a god. To these archaeologists, the backfilling wasn't a single event. It happened over centuries. Each generation would come, perhaps perform a final ritual in one of the enclosures, and then fill it in, burying it with the bones of their feasting animals and their broken tools as offerings. Then they would build a new, smaller, and less impressive enclosure nearby. Over time, the entire site was mounded over. It wasn't a frantic effort to hide a warning. It was a respectful decommissioning of a sacred space that had run its course. But why would their sacred space, the center of their world for 1,000 years, run its course? Because their world was changing in the most fundamental way imaginable. The hunter-gatherers who built the great enclosures were giving way to a new kind of human, the farmer. The shift from a nomadic hunting lifestyle to a settled, agricultural one is the single greatest revolution in human history. And it was happening right here, right at this time. The Fertile Crescent is the cradle of agriculture. Perhaps the gods of the hunt, the wild beasts carved on the T-pillars, no longer served the people who were learning to domesticate animals and cultivate wheat. A new lifestyle required a new religion, new rituals, new gods. Burying Göbekli Tepe was a way of closing a chapter. It was the symbolic act of turning their backs on the wild world of their ancestors and stepping into the new ordered world of civilization. They were burying the past to make way for the future. So we are left with two staggering possibilities. Did they bury their temple because their world was ending in fire from the sky? A desperate attempt to warn the future about the fragility of life and the dangers lurking in the cosmos? Or did they bury it because they themselves were in the process of creating an entirely new world, a world of fields, farms, and villages, a world that would change the planet forever? The answer might lie not in why they buried their past, but in the revolution they were about to unleash. This revolution wasn't fought with swords and shields, but with seeds and stone sickles. We call it the agricultural revolution, and it's arguably the single most important event in our species' history. It's the moment we stopped chasing our food and started growing it. The traditional story, the one taught in schools for generations, is simple and clean. It goes like this. Humans, clever as they are, eventually figured out that planting seeds was a more reliable way to get food than hunting aurochs. This led to surplus grain, which allowed them to settle down in one place. Villages popped up, populations grew, and with all this newfound free time and stability, they finally had the luxury to develop complex culture, art, and religion. First came the farm, then the village, and only then the temple. It's a neat, logical progression, and for over a century it's what we believed. But Göbekli Tepe takes that entire timeline, that entire neat and tidy story, and shatters it into a million pieces. Because Göbekli Tepe is the temple that comes before the city. It's the grand cathedral built before the parish. The people who built this place weren't farmers living in permanent villages. The evidence is overwhelming. They were nomadic hunter-gatherers. We found no signs of settled villages around the site from that earliest period. No domesticated animals. No cultivated fields. Just the bones of wild gazelle, wild boar, and wild sheep, and the remains of wild grasses and nuts they foraged. So we are faced with an earth-shattering paradox. How could wandering bands of foragers, people with no permanent address, no kings, no bureaucracy, and supposedly no agriculture, organize themselves to build something on this monumental scale? It's like finding a fully functional airport in the middle of the Stone Age. It just doesn't fit. This is where the late, great archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, the man who dedicated his life to this hill, proposed a theory so radical it flipped history on its head. He looked at the evidence and said we've had it backwards the entire time. It wasn't agriculture that led to civilization and religion. It was the desire for religion that led to agriculture. Göbekli Tepe, he argued, was the cause, not the consequence. Think about the logistics. Quarrying, transporting, and erecting a single one of these T-shaped pillars, weighing up to 15 tons, would have required the coordinated effort of hundreds of people. And there are over 200 known pillars. This wasn't a weekend project for a small family clan. This was a multi-generational undertaking, requiring a massive, sustained workforce drawn from different tribes across a vast region. Imagine it. Hundreds, maybe thousands, of people converging on this sacred hill for ritual gatherings, for massive feasts, for the sacred work of construction. Now ask yourself the most basic question. How do you feed them all? You can't just hope a herd of gazelle wanders by. Hunting and gathering in the surrounding area would be stripped bare in weeks. The sheer demand for food would have been relentless. It would have been the single greatest logistical challenge they had ever faced. And necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention. Schmidt's theory posits that to solve this unprecedented catering problem, the people of Göbekli Tepe began to experiment. They wouldn't have just waited for wild wheat and barley to grow. They would have started actively managing it, clearing patches of land, sowing seeds, selecting for the best strains. They were, in essence, forced to invent farming to support their religious habit. The world's first temple became the world's first driver of agricultural innovation. And the evidence is tantalizing. Just 20 miles from Göbekli Tepe lies a mountain called Karaca Dag. It is here geneticists have discovered that the wild ancestor of 68 different modern strains of domesticated einkorn wheat still grows today. This is the ground zero for the wheat that would eventually feed the entire world, from the bread on your table to the pasta in your bowl. The timing is a perfect match. The very first experiments in domesticating this wild grass were happening in this exact region, at the exact same time that Göbekli Tepe was at its peak. It seems increasingly likely that the first farmers weren't trying to change the world. They were just trying to provide enough food for the next great feast at their cathedral on a hill. Religion was the engine, and agriculture was the fuel it demanded. But this solution, this incredible invention, came at a staggering cost. It may have been, as some historians have called it, the greatest bait and switch in human history. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle, while precarious, was in some ways healthier. Their diet was incredibly varied: nuts, berries, roots, fish, a wide range of game. They worked, on average, far fewer hours than early farmers or even us today. The transition to farming chained humanity to a life of back-breaking labor. The diet narrowed dramatically, often to just a few staple crops like wheat. Skeletons from the first farming communities show a host of new problems. Rampant tooth decay from high carbohydrate diets, signs of iron deficiency anemia, arthritis from repetitive motions of grinding grain, and a decrease in average height. By living in close quarters with domesticated animals, we exposed ourselves to a whole new world of infectious diseases that could jump from livestock to humans. Smallpox, measles, influenza. These are the dark legacies of the agricultural revolution. So why did they do it? Why trade a life of relative freedom and variety for one of toil and disease? Because once they started down that path, there was no turning back. Agriculture could support a much larger population in a smaller area. And as the population grew, the pressure to produce even more food intensified. You couldn't just abandon the fields and go back to the old ways. There were too many mouths to feed, and the wild herds that once sustained your ancestors were dwindling. The old skills of the deep hunt were being forgotten. They had crossed a point of no return. They had traded quality of life for quantity of calories. And this brings us back to that final profound act at Göbekli Tepe, the burial. Perhaps burying the temple was a recognition that the world it represented was gone forever. The hunter-gatherer gods, the spirits of the wild animals carved on those pillars, belonged to a world of open plains and migrating herds. The new world was one of fields, fences, and property lines. The new gods would be gods of the harvest, of the sun and the rain, of fertility and the changing seasons. The new life of a farmer required a different mindset. It was a life of relentless planning, of worrying about drought and blight, of defending your stored grain from neighbors. It was a world of mine instead of ours. Burying Göbekli Tepe wasn't just covering a temple with dirt. It was a funeral. It was the final symbolic act of a people burying their own nomadic past, closing the door on the world of the hunter and stepping fully into the world of the farmer. They were burying the very ideology that had sparked this revolution in the first place. But this new world of surplus and settlement didn't just create new diseases and diets. It created something else, something that had never existed before in human society. Deep systemic inequality. For the first time, some people could accumulate more than others, leading to power, hierarchy, and control. The world born from the dust of Göbekli Tepe would be a world of chiefs and commoners, of priests and peasants, of the haves and the have-nots. And within this new world, the temple itself became the ultimate stage. Göbekli Tepe wasn't just a place of worship, it was a theater of power. The ones who held the knowledge, the ones who understood the stars, the seasons, the secret meanings carved into the stone, they were the directors of this grand performance. The rest were the audience and perhaps the actors in a ritual they didn't fully comprehend. The massive pillars weren't just markers, they were the set pieces. The carvings weren't just decoration, they were the script. And the rituals that took place here, under the Anatolian sky, were the dramatic performances that cemented this new social order into the very soul of humanity. Imagine standing there 11,000 years ago. The sun sets and the only light comes from flickering torches, casting long dancing shadows that make the stone animals seem to writhe and twist. The air is thick with the smell of roasting meat from the feasting pits and the sharp, fermented scent of the world's first beer, brewed in huge limestone vats found right here on site. This wasn't just a somber religious ceremony. It was a festival, a gathering of the clans, a spectacle designed to overwhelm the senses. And at the center of it all, a shaman, a priest, a storyteller, interpreting the symbols that surrounded them. But what were those symbols? What story were they telling? When we look closely at the carvings, we find a strange and terrifying zoo. There are no gentle gazelles or docile sheep, the primary food sources for these people. Instead, the pillars are crawling with creatures of power and danger. Snakes slither up the stone. Spiders and scorpions with their venomous stings are carved in sharp relief. We see ferocious wild boars, powerful aurochs, and lean, cunning foxes. And soaring above them all, the vulture, the master of the sky, the final attendant to the dead. This is not a menu. This is a pantheon of nightmares. These were the creatures that haunted the Paleolithic mind. The predators in the dark, the symbols of sudden death, of unseen threats. Why carve your fears into your most sacred space? The answer might lie in the very nature of belief. To control something, you must first name it, depict it, and confront it. By carving these fearsome beasts, the people of Göbekli Tepe were perhaps trying to harness their power, to appease their spirits, to create a kind of spiritual armor against the chaos of the natural world. Each animal could have represented a different clan, a different spiritual guide, a different force of nature. The temple becomes a meeting place not just for people, but for the totemic spirits that define them. But among all this terrifying fauna, the human depictions are even more unsettling. Humans are rarely shown, and when they are often strange, stylized, and incomplete. We see figures with no faces, no mouths, no eyes. They are often depicted without heads. One of the most famous and disturbing pillars, Pillar 43, often called the Vulture Stone, gives us a chilling glimpse into their worldview. It's a complex narrative scene, a kind of Stone Age comic book panel. On it, we see a host of animals, but the central figure is a headless man. A large vulture stands beside him, one wing outstretched as if in a gesture of protection or perhaps consumption. The man's head is represented by a simple disc or circle. What on earth does this mean? For decades, archaeologists have debated this single image. Is it a depiction of a specific person, a fallen leader, or is it something more symbolic? The most compelling theory connects it to a practice known as excarnation, or what we might call a sky burial. This is a funeral rite where a body is left exposed to the elements and to scavenging birds, like vultures. In many ancient cultures, from Tibetan Buddhists to Zoroastrians, this was seen as a way to release the soul from the flesh. The vulture wasn't a fearsome scavenger, but a sacred intermediary, a psychopomp, carrying the spirit of the deceased from the earthly realm to the celestial one. The head, often seen as the seat of the soul, was treated with special reverence. Perhaps the headless bodies depicted at Göbekli Tepe weren't victims of violence, but revered ancestors on their final journey. The temple then becomes a liminal space, a gateway between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. This theory gains even more weight when we consider the sheer number of human bone fragments found at the site, many of which show cut marks and scraping, consistent with the flesh being deliberately removed from the bone after death. Skulls, in particular, seem to have been treated differently. Several skull fragments have been found with deep, intentional grooves carved into them, suggesting they were decorated, hung, or used in rituals long after the person had died. This wasn't just a temple for the gods. It was a mortuary complex, a center for a sophisticated and elaborate cult of the dead. It was a place where people came to commune with their ancestors, to seek their wisdom, and to ensure the continuity of life by honoring those who came before. So let's go back to that ritual. The firelight, the beer, the chanting. The shaman isn't just telling stories of the hunt. He's telling the story of creation, of life and death, of the journey of the soul. He points to the vulture stone, recounting the tale of a great ancestor, now a star in the sky. He holds up a decorated skull, a tangible link to the spirit world. The participants, their senses heightened by the drink, the music, the flickering shadows, are not just listening. They are experiencing it. They feel the presence of the spirits, the power of the animals, the protective gaze of their ancestors. And this is where the power of the new elite becomes undeniable. The shaman priests weren't just religious figures. They were the masters of this psychosocial technology. They understood how to use architecture, art, storytelling, and quite possibly altered states of consciousness to create a shared reality, a common belief system that could bind thousands of people together. They created a cosmos, and they placed themselves at its very center, as the only ones who could interpret its signs and speak with its spirits. The common hunter, who brought a gazelle as an offering, didn't need to understand the precise astronomical alignment of the pillars. He just needed to believe that the shaman did. He needed to believe that his participation, his labor, his offering, was contributing to the cosmic order, ensuring the return of the seasons and the favor of the spirits. This belief was the glue that held their new, larger society together. It was the justification for the hierarchy. Some people worked the fields or hunted, while others worked the heavens. Göbekli Tepe was the machine that manufactured this belief. It was a place of immense spiritual power, but also immense social control. It was the blueprint for civilization built not on grain but on gods. But this raises the most profound question of all. If this place was so important, if it was the very heart of their world for over 1,000 years, the center of their universe, why did they bury it? They didn't just abandon it to the winds. They deliberately and painstakingly filled it in, ton by ton, with millions of cubic feet of earth and debris, preserving it perfectly in a man-made hill. Why would a people intentionally entomb their most sacred creation? What could possibly lead them to erase their own world? The act itself is almost incomprehensible. Imagine building the great cathedrals of Europe, a project spanning generations, a testament to your entire worldview, and then at the height of its glory deciding to bury it. Not abandon it to the wind and rain, but to deliberately and methodically entomb it. This wasn't a casual act of neglect. This was an intentional, massive undertaking, perhaps requiring as much effort as the construction itself. The fill used to bury the enclosures wasn't just random dirt. It was a mixture of rubble, limestone fragments, stone tools, and countless animal bones, the detritus of their daily lives and ritual feasts. It's as if they packed their entire world in with the temple. So why? Why go to such colossal lengths to make something disappear? Archaeologists are faced with one of the greatest riddles in human history, and the theories are as fascinating as the site itself. One of the most prominent ideas is that this was not an act of destruction, but the ultimate act of reverence. In this view, the temple wasn't being discarded. It was being given a proper burial. Perhaps for these people, sacred sites like living beings had a life cycle. They were born from the earth, served their purpose, and then had to be respectfully returned to the earth. The act of filling it in wasn't erasure, but a final grand ceremony, the last and most important ritual the site would ever see. By sealing it away, they were protecting it for eternity, safeguarding its immense power from the profane world, or perhaps sending it on to the spirit realm. It's a beautiful, poetic idea that the builders loved their creation so much, they chose to give it a peaceful death rather than let it decay into ruin. But there are other, more pragmatic theories, rooted in the dramatic changes sweeping the globe at that exact moment in time. The era of Göbekli Tepe's burial around 8000 BC coincides almost perfectly with the end of the last gasp of the Ice Age, a period of rapid, chaotic climate change known as the Younger Dryas. For millennia, their world had been a hunter's paradise. A cooler, drier climate supported vast grasslands teeming with the game they revered and hunted: gazelle, aurochs, wild ass. Their entire cosmology, their social structure, their very survival was built around the rhythms of the hunt. Then the world changed. The climate warmed, the rains came, and the forests began to spread. The great open plains and the massive herds that roamed them began to shrink and disappear. The very foundation of their existence was crumbling beneath their feet. In this context, the burial of Göbekli Tepe takes on a different, more desperate meaning. Was it a last-ditch effort to appease the spirits or gods of their world? A monumental sacrifice to try and turn back the tide of climate change, to bring back the animals that were vanishing? Or was it an admission of defeat? A recognition that the world of the hunter was over? By burying their temple, they were burying their way of life. It was a funeral not just for a building but for an entire epoch. They were closing the book on the Paleolithic world and turning a new page, forced into it by a world that no longer answered their prayers. This leads directly to another powerful theory, one that sees the burial not as an act of piety or desperation, but as the result of a profound social and ideological revolution. What was the new world that climate change was creating? It was a world of agriculture. The very same people who were burying Göbekli Tepe were, at this exact time, beginning to experiment with domesticating the wild grasses that grew on the hills around them, the ancestors of modern wheat. They were shifting from chasing their food to growing it. This is arguably the single most important transformation in human history, and it's impossible to overstate the ideological earthquake it would have caused. The hunter-gatherer worldview is fundamentally different from the farmer's. The hunter is a participant in the natural world, reliant on the cycles of animal migration, the wisdom of the shaman, and the spirits of the wild. The farmer, by contrast, seeks to control the natural world. They clear the land, plant the seeds, and manage the harvest. Their gods are different, deities of fertility, sun, and rain. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe, with its terrifying predators and its focus on the wild, untamed world of the hunt, became a symbol of the old, failed way of life. The new agricultural society, with its new needs and new beliefs, may have rejected the old gods. The burial, then, could have been an act of ideological cleansing, a way to literally put the old religion underground, to sever ties with a past that was no longer relevant or perhaps was now seen as dangerous. They weren't just burying stone pillars. They were burying an idea that had held humanity in its thrall for hundreds of thousands of years. And then there is the darkest, most unsettling possibility. What if they buried Göbekli Tepe out of fear? Look again at the carvings. These aren't just peaceful depictions of nature. We see headless men, spiders, scorpions, and vultures, birds intimately associated with death and excarnation. The rituals performed here were likely intense, shamanistic, and perhaps terrifying. They may have involved altered states of consciousness, communion with powerful and unpredictable spirits. What if, in their attempts to harness the powers of the cosmos, they unleashed something they could not control? Maybe a terrible plague swept through their community. Maybe a social schism tore their society apart. Maybe a drought or famine brought them to the brink of extinction. If they believed that the temple itself was the source of this calamity, that the spirits they had summoned had turned against them, burying it would be the only logical response. It wouldn't be a burial of reverence, but an act of containment. They were locking a malevolent force back in the earth, sealing a Pandora's box of cosmic power that had brought them nothing but ruin. In this scenario, the millions of tons of earth piled on top aren't a blanket. They're the bars of a prison cell, designed to hold something terrible at bay for all time. Each of these theories, sacred burial, climate-driven desperation, ideological revolution, or pure terror, paints a vivid picture of this pivotal moment. And it's entirely possible that the truth is a complex tapestry woven from all of them. A changing climate forced them towards agriculture, which sparked a new ideology, which demanded the reverent but fearful burial of the old world and its powerful, dangerous gods. Whatever the specific reason, the act of burying Göbekli Tepe marks a profound turning point. It is a line in the sand drawn 10,000 years ago. On one side lies the entire history of humanity up to that point. A world of nomadic hunters of animal spirits, a world we can now only glimpse through the stone eyes of the figures on these pillars. On the other side lies everything that came after. Agriculture, villages, cities, writing, empires. They didn't just bury a temple, they buried a reality. And in doing so, they cleared the ground for a new world to be born from its ashes. The question is, what was that world? And how did the legacy of these mysterious builders shape the very foundations of our own civilization? That new world was our world. The world of the farmer. The world of the village, the town, and eventually the city. For decades, the story of humanity was simple. First, we learned to farm. The surplus food allowed us to settle down. With time on our hands, we developed complex societies, hierarchies, and finally religion and monumental art. Agriculture was the engine, and culture was the caboose. Göbekli Tepe takes that entire, neat little story and turns it on its head. It suggests the exact opposite happened. The desire to build, to worship, to gather and express a shared cosmic vision. That asterisk was the engine. Agriculture was the consequence. Imagine the sheer logistical nightmare. Thousands of people, from dozens of different hunter-gatherer bands, converging on this one sacred hill. They need to be fed. Not for a day, not for a week, but for months, even years at a time, generation after generation. The wild game in the area would be depleted in a heartbeat. The wild grains and fruits stripped bare. You can't run a project of this magnitude on a whim and a prayer. You need a system. You need a guaranteed food supply. This monumental religious project created a problem that demanded an unprecedented solution. And that solution was the domestication of plants and animals. Right here, in the Fertile Crescent, within a few hundred miles of Göbekli Tepe, is where the Neolithic Revolution ignited. It's where einkorn wheat, one of the first domesticated grains, was cultivated. Genetic studies have traced the DNA of modern domesticated wheat back to a wild ancestor that grew on the slopes of a mountain just 20 miles from the temple. This is not a coincidence. This is a smoking gun. The world's first temple wasn't a product of the agricultural revolution. It was the catalyst. The immense spiritual and social gravity of this place forced humanity's hand. The gods on their T-shaped pillars demanded a tribute, and that tribute was the invention of a new way of life. They weren't just building a temple, they were building the future. But what happened to the builders themselves? When the last basket of dirt was thrown onto the highest pillar, did they simply walk away and forget everything? Of course not. An idea this powerful doesn't just vanish. It spreads. It mutates. It becomes the seed for future cultures. Think of it like a cultural Big Bang. The people who held the knowledge of Göbekli Tepe, the architects, the astronomers, the priests, eventually dispersed. They carried with them a blueprint, a civilization package containing the core concepts of social hierarchy, organized labor, cosmic symbolism, and monumental construction. They fanned out across the Fertile Crescent and beyond, and wherever they went, new sparks of civilization began to appear. Thousands of years later, but in the same region of Anatolia, we see the rise of Çatalhöyük, one of the world's first true cities. And what do we find there? We find a deep reverence for the bull, the aurochs, just like the ones carved at Göbekli Tepe. We find ritualistic practices involving skulls and ancestors. We see a level of symbolic and artistic expression that seems to echo a much older tradition. Is it a direct lineage? It's hard to prove, but it feels like a memory, a cultural echo passed down through the millennia. The hardware had changed. They were now living in mud brick houses instead of circular huts, but the spiritual software seemed to carry remnants of a much older code. And the echoes travel even further. Look at the earliest civilizations that we do have written records for, Sumer and Egypt. They seem to explode into existence with a fully formed understanding of astronomy, agriculture, and social organization. The Sumerians spoke of sages, the Apkallu, who came from the sea after a great flood and gave them the gifts of civilization. The Egyptians spoke of a time of the gods, the Zep Tepi, a golden age when divine beings laid the foundations of their society. These have always been dismissed as myths. But what if they are distorted memories? What if these gods or sages were not divine beings, but the descendants of the Göbekli Tepe culture, people carrying the ancestral knowledge of a lost world? The very structure of their belief seems to resonate with what we see on that Turkish hilltop. The T-shaped pillars are anthropomorphic. They are stylized human forms. They are beings, not just columns. This idea of representing gods in humanoid form, of creating a pantheon of powerful non-human entities who watch over humanity, might have been born right there. Before Göbekli Tepe, spirituality was likely animistic, a belief in the spirits of trees, rocks, and animals. Here we see the first evidence of organized religion, of gods who have a home, who demand worship, and who are served by a priestly class. This is the template for virtually every religion that followed. And what about their cosmic knowledge? The alignments we see at Göbekli Tepe, the focus on Sirius, the solstices, the constellations of the zodiac. This is the foundational language of sky religions all over the ancient world. From the pyramids of Giza aligned to Orion's belt, to the stone circles of Europe marking the solar calendar, this sacred astronomy had to start somewhere. Göbekli Tepe is by far our oldest candidate for that starting point. These weren't just hunters gazing at the stars for fun. They were scientists. They were mathematicians. They were tracking precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, a cycle that takes nearly 26,000 years to complete. This is not simple knowledge. This is advanced, long-term observational science that was supposedly not invented for another 10,000 years. The legacy of Göbekli Tepe isn't just in stone and dirt. It's woven into the DNA of our myths, our religions, and our oldest sciences. The builders were the forgotten founding fathers. They cracked the code of civilization. They figured out how to organize society on a grand scale, how to unite disparate tribes under a single unifying idea. They created a symbolic language that could communicate complex concepts across generations. They laid the groundwork for everything that came after. And then they were erased. Not by a conqueror, not by a cataclysm, but by their own children. The world they helped create, the world of agriculture, was a one-way street. Once you have a reliable food source, permanent homes, and growing populations, there is no going back to the old ways. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle, the worldview that had sustained humanity for hundreds of thousands of years, became obsolete. And Göbekli Tepe was a monument to that old world. It was a cathedral to a dying way of life. Burying it was not an act of destruction. It was a statement. It was the turning of a page. They were closing the book on the Ice Age and beginning a new chapter, the chapter of settlement, of property, of kings, and eventually of history itself. But in burying their temple, they also buried their story. Without writing, their achievements were entrusted to oral tradition, to myth and song. And over 500 generations, the story warped. The great builders became giants. The wise astronomers became gods. The global cataclysm of the Younger Dryas, with its melting glaciers and rising seas, became a great flood sent to punish mankind. The memory of this incredible, real-world achievement dissolved into the realm of legend. Humanity developed a planetary amnesia. We forgot our own origin story. We forgot that our leap into civilization wasn't a slow, gradual climb, but a quantum leap, sparked by a religious fervor on a lonely hilltop 12,000 years ago. For millennia, the secrets of these master builders lay sleeping under a man-made hill, their legacy only visible in the faintest of echoes in the cultures that followed. We see their fingerprints everywhere, but we never knew whose they were. Until now. But as we decipher the meaning of the structures and the astronomical alignments, we are forced to confront an even more profound possibility. We've been looking at their legacy in terms of architecture and society. But what if their most important legacy, their most urgent message, is something else entirely? What if the carvings on those pillars are more than just pictures of animals and symbols of the cosmos? What if we've only just scratched the surface of what they were trying to tell us? What if that message was a warning, a desperate attempt by the survivors of a global catastrophe to tell the future what they had witnessed? This isn't just wild speculation. The clue might be hiding in plain sight, carved into one of the most enigmatic pillars ever unearthed. Pillar 43, known to the world as the Vulture Stone. At first glance, it's a chaotic jumble of symbols. A large vulture, a scorpion, other birds, and a strange headless human figure at the bottom. For years, archaeologists saw it as a depiction of a sky burial, a common funerary practice where bodies are left for vultures to consume, releasing the spirit. It's a compelling idea, but it might be a massive misinterpretation. A group of researchers from the University of Edinburgh looked at the vulture stone not as a picture, but as a map, a star map. They proposed a mind-bending theory that the animals on the pillar are not just animals. They are representations of constellations. The scorpion at the bottom is almost unmistakably our modern constellation Scorpius. The birds, they argue, correspond to other familiar patterns in the night sky. And the vulture? The vulture, they believe, represents Sagittarius, which our ancestors often saw as a great bird. Suddenly, the chaotic scene snaps into focus. It's not a random assortment of carvings, it's a specific arrangement of stars. It's a snapshot of the sky at a particular moment in time. This is where it gets truly chilling. Using sophisticated computer software that can model the night sky from any point in Earth's history, the researchers wound back the clock. They looked for a time when the constellations on the pillar, Scorpius, Sagittarius, Libra, Virgo, would have been in the exact positions depicted relative to the sun, and they found a match. A precise, undeniable match. The date stamped on the vulture stone, encoded in the stars, is 10,950 BC. Give or take 250 years. That date is not random. It is arguably one of the most important dates in prehistory. 10,950 BC is the exact moment that the world plunged into a sudden and catastrophic deep freeze. It's the beginning of the Younger Dryas, that 1,000-year-long mini-ice age we've talked about. The moment the climate, which had been warming since the end of the last major ice age, suddenly and violently reversed course. The moment mammoths vanished. The moment the Clovis culture in North America disappeared. The moment the world changed forever. For decades, scientists debated what could have caused such a rapid climate shift. The leading theory now is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. It suggests that a fragmented comet, a swarm of cosmic debris, slammed into the Earth. The impacts, possibly on the North American ice sheet, would have been apocalyptic. They would have triggered continent-spanning wildfires, vaporized millions of tons of ice, and thrown so much dust and water into the atmosphere that it blocked out the sun, plunging the planet into a nuclear winter. Now look again at the vulture stone. It's a date stamp for the beginning of the apocalypse. The headless man at the bottom is no longer just a symbol of a single person's death. It represents mass death, cataclysm, the loss of a world. The pillar isn't a funeral scene, it's a memorial. A memorial for an entire generation, perhaps for humanity's entire way of life up to that point. The people of Göbekli Tepe weren't just building a temple to the gods. They were the survivors. They were building a monument to the single worst day in human history, etching the memory of the sky that fell into eternal stone, so that no one would ever forget. This theory provides a powerful, terrifying explanation for so much of what makes Göbekli Tepe a mystery. The immense effort the collective will require to build it? It was driven by the trauma of a shared catastrophe, a need to make sense of the senseless, to create order from the chaos that had consumed their world. And the most baffling mystery of all, the deliberate burial of the site, suddenly makes perfect sense. They weren't abandoning it. They were preserving it. They understood that their world was fragile, that civilizations rise and fall. They were creating a time capsule. By carefully, painstakingly burying their most sacred creation under tons and tons of earth, they were protecting it from the ravages of time. They were sealing away their message, their warning, their story, in the hopes that one day a future civilization, a civilization that could also read the stars, would find it and understand. They were sending a message across 12,000 years, not just to us but for us. A warning that the sky, which gives us life, can also bring unimaginable destruction. If this is true, it changes everything. It means these so-called primitive hunter-gatherers were not only sophisticated astronomers but also historians, memorializing a specific event with a precision we barely thought possible. It means they had a deep, traumatic history that they felt compelled to record for posterity. They weren't just looking up at the sky in simple wonder. They were watching it with caution, with memory, with the hard-earned wisdom of survivors. And yet, this is still just one theory, however compelling it may be. The truth is, we have only excavated about 5% of Göbekli Tepe. 95% of this monumental complex, with potentially hundreds more T-shaped pillars, remains buried beneath that man-made hill. What other stories, what other warnings, what other celestial maps are waiting down there in the dark? Are there pillars that tell of the aftermath? Pillars that describe the world they rebuilt from the ashes? We just don't know. Göbekli Tepe is not just a collection of old stones. It is a fundamental challenge to the story we tell about ourselves. It proves that the spark of human ingenuity, the drive to create meaning, and the capacity for monumental vision existed long before the first cities were built or the first words were written down. It is a silent testament to a lost chapter of our story, a chapter filled with genius, trauma, and a resilience that is almost impossible to comprehend. These people, our ancestors, looked up at the same stars we see tonight, but they saw them differently. They saw in them a story of loss and survival. They saw a cosmic clock that governed their fate. And in the face of oblivion, they didn't just scatter and die. They came together. They organized. They hauled multi-ton pillars across the landscape and carved their story into them with flint and bone. They built a monument that would outlast their language, their culture, and their memory. A monument so profound that it is forcing us, 12,000 years later, to rewrite the very beginning of our own history. The message of Göbekli Tepe, then, may be far simpler and more profound than any single celestial event. It's a message about us, about our species. It tells us that when faced with the ultimate challenge, we don't just survive. We create, we build, we remember, and we send messages into the future, hoping that someone someday will be listening.